Oh my goodness. That was such an amazing welcome. Beautiful, beautiful introduction. Thank you so much. Well, I'm really jealous of all of you who are there who get to listen to all the talks for this amazing conference that Jenny has put together. I was able to listen to Gabriella's wonderful keynote yesterday, and I will be trying to sit in on the last section, but everything else is in the middle of the night for me, so I hope you'll forgive me for not being there. I want to thank in advance Florian for his response, and I'm going to share my screen now before I forget. Okay, I'm assuming that you see that. That looks good from here. Okay, so nuclear hauntings and memory fields for the time being. It's early July 2023. I'm sitting at my desk reading today's news. I reside on the unceded traditional territory of Huchen, the ancestral homeland of Chochenyo-speaking Lishan Ohlone people. Lishan Ohlone tribal chair Karina Gould has co-founded and co-directs the Segurite Land Trust, an urban woman-led organization that engages in practices of rematriation, cultural revitalization, and land restoration. Segurite calls on Native and non-Native peoples to heal and transform the legacies of colonization, genocide, and patriarchy. The trust, which oversees the nearby Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which together with the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, has been the United States government's primary institutions for nuclear weapons research and development. It is July 5th, not a particularly exceptional day news-wise. It is simply the day I am making some notes with this talk in mind. Despite the fact that Westerners, those in the global north, have had their attention deflected from nuclear issues since the end of the Cold War, nuclear matters have a way of refusing containment and leaking into things. Indeed, far from being locatable in space and time, nuclear matters attest to their undoing. Today is a week and a half before the anniversary of the first nuclear explosion, Trinity Test, which took place on July 16th, 1945 at 5:29 a.m. in Hernando del Muerto Desert within the state the colonizers call New Mexico. I'm sipping my morning coffee and looking at the day's headlines on the NPR website, one of several I read. And two of the top stories for the day are news items about nuclear issues. One headline, Ukraine Zelensky warns of possible Russian sabotage at nuclear plant, speaks to a critical point anti-nuclear activists and others have been making for decades. It is impossible to draw a line in the sand separating issues of nuclear power from those of nuclear weapons, giving lie to the alleged division between nuclear power and nuclear powers. The possibility of using the Ukrainian Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, dwarfing Chernobyl, as a weapon has been an active threat, a ticking time bomb for more than a year now, following Russia's opening move in the invasion of Ukraine, which was a notable strategic move to capture the nuclear power plant. The other story, the UN's nuclear watchdog says Japan can release nuclear wastewater into the ocean, tells of a plan to pour more than 1 million tons of radioactive wastewater left over from the Fukushima power plant disaster of March 11, 2011, into the Pacific Ocean, with the blessings of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which promises oversight of the release over the next 30 to 40 years. Approval was granted despite the fact that the plan has drawn significant criticism from the scientific community. Critics also cite the fact that this is a transboundary issue that will not only affect Japan. Reading this, I am pleasantly surprised that the article mentions the nearly 70 atomic bombs the US exploded in the Marshall Islands from 1946 to 1958, which turned the small nation state into an open air and watered laboratory. And it actually goes on to make the direct connection, quote, many across the Pacific say the wastewater release plan is a continuation of the Pacific's traumatizing relationship with nuclear technology and harkens to a past when larger powers used their islands and their people as collateral damage to further their nuclear ambitions. If I'm getting ready to speak at length about ghosts, inheritance, and generations of ghosts, which is to say about certain others who are not present, not presently living, either to us, in us, or outside us, it is in the name of justice where it is not yet there. It is necessary to speak of the ghosts, indeed to the ghosts, and with it. No justice seems possible or thinkable without the principle of some responsibility beyond all living present, without this non-contemporaneity with itself of the living present, without this responsibility and this respect for justice concerning those who are not there, of those who are no longer or who are not yet present and living. What sense would it be to ask the question, where? Where tomorrow, whither? This is, of course, Derrida's quote in Spectres of Marx. In other words, for Derrida, hauntings are questions of justice and matters of untimeliness, matters of time being out of joint. Now from Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being. A pine tree is time, and bamboo is time. Mountains are time, oceans are time. If time is annihilated, mountains and oceans are annihilated. Time itself is being, and all being is time. In essence, everything in the entire universe is intimately linked with each other as moments in time, continuous and separate. Time presses down upon us these days, its face pressed against ours. Apocalyptic narratives proliferate and weigh on us. If one apocalypse or another, or a conjunction of multiple ones, doesn't get us, at least not yet, there is nonetheless a sense of impending doom, of a future already squandered. But the very notion of apocalypse, which is always coming, in every epoch it seems, is premised on a future-focused linear construction of time that serves the workings of racialized capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism. There's a deadly sense of forward-facing directionality and inevitability built in, an end time, a time that kills time. And all the while in these times is the constant background hum of uncertain times, as if time is already set, as in a great clockwork, an invention some deity set in motion at time t equals 0, and watches as history is revealed bit by bit. It will all unfold given enough time. It's just that, at least for now, we don't yet know what will happen. The future is out in front and uncertain, that is unknowable for now. But that in itself is a trap. The future isn't given, out there awaiting our arrival. The future, wait. The notion of the future is itself already problematic and it assumes that futurity is one. So I will interrupt and restart this sentence rather than running with it to its inevitable conclusion. What if futurity is understood not as a matter of uncertainty, but rather of indeterminacy? The notion of uncertainty sits happily with the idea of clock time, whereas indeterminacy opens up possibilities unthinkable within the structures of clock time. The political difference is enormously consequential. Futures are not inevitable, neither are they all out in front. And it's important to get the uncertainty trope, this repetitive drumbeat out of our heads, out of our bodies, and the ways we comport them and think about what they can and can't do. to interrupt this imaginary that, among other things, mutes the polyrhythmic silent cacophony of nothingness, the infinite material possibilities of here, now, there, then, that live inside this very now, this thick now that dances like ripples on an ocean of yearning. That is, the uncertainty drumbeat mutes the play of the virtual, which is not only inseparable from materiality, but contributes to its constitution. For time is not the continuous flow of moments that pushes forward without any worldly concerns. Rather, time in its materiality is integral to the field of space-time mattering. Crucially, to speak of other temporalities, to insist, for example, that the past haunts us and is alive in the thick now of the present moment, that time doesn't move along in a line as a succession of moments, but rather entails an infinity of possibilities such as asynchronicity, indeterminacy, superpositions, and entanglements, all manner of interruptions of the ordering of past, present, and future in their presumed presences and sequentiality. Temporality is not limited to specific matters of the human experience of time. The point is not merely to call out another instance of human exceptionalism, but additionally to bring to the fore another assumption that produces violence, that humans are thereby understood to be a fundamentally different ontological order than time, or rather space-time mattering, albeit subject to it, as if the human itself, as its own kind of independent presence, simply shows up on a stage called history or the social at some moment in time. And as if experience is to be understood as a perceptual lens that filters and reorders what actually unfolds in time. The point is that the point is that this ontological splitting positions the human as its own thing independently of the land timescape, or so-called environment within which it appears, as if that which matters, the human, is the other to its situatedness, along with the notion that there is a reality out there that exists independently of the human. But what if space-time mattering, if time, that is space-time mattering, has another face, another history, another sense of being? What if time being is understood, that is touched into, as a matter of touching, of being in touch, being touched by everything and nothing? In this sense of mattering, not even the great divide, perhaps the ultimate divide, deeper even than the seemingly unbridgeable divides between life and non-life, organic and inorganic, animate and inanimate, the very divide that undergirds all the other divides, that between existence and non-existence, cannot be taken as given. If the nature of existence / non-existence is not a binary, but rather an indeterminacy cut together apart that undermines ontology in favor of a hauntology, thereby calling into question the belief that there exists some ontological division or divisions that can justifiably be assumed from the outset, which is not the same thing as suggesting a flat ontology, but a hauntology that is a dynamism of differentiating and tangling. In my agential realist reading of quantum field theory, time being, becoming, is an activity of the world in its materiality. Time beings do not inhabit or take a place, but rather are of the land timescape, the space-time mattering the world in its sedimented enfoldings of iterative interactivity. Time beings are excitations of the field of space-time mattering and are inseparable from nothingness, from all possible yearnings, imaginings, desirings to become. And relatedly, memory does not reside in the folds of individual brains. Rather, memory is the enfoldings of space-time mattering written into the universe, or better, the enfolded articulations of the universe and its mattering. Memory is not a record of a fixed past that can ever be erased, written over, or simply recovered. And remembering is not a replay of a string of moments, but an enlivening and reconfiguring of past and future that is larger than any individual. That is, memory is not merely a subjective capacity of the human mind, rather, human and mind are part of the space-time mattering of the world. Memory is written into the worlding of the world in all its specificities, or rather, memory is constituted in and through the world's iterative reconfigurings, rememberings. The world holds the memory of all configurings and iterative reconfigurings, or rather, the world is its memory, rememberings. This agential realist tale of time, beings, and memory is a hauntological matter. Importantly, agential realism is not reducible to quantum physics. It is not even premised on quantum physics, but rather, as part of agential realism, I offer an agential realist relational ontology interpretation of quantum physics. This is not an innocent interpretation, but it is a legitimate contender among competing interpretations of quantum physics, where legitimacy is traditionally conferred by physicists studying the foundations of quantum mechanics. And that's important because it means that it is possible to engage in practices of doing physics differently, in particular by incorporating insights derived from theories of justice. Matter fell from grace during the 20th century. What was once labeled inanimate became mortal. Very soon after that, it was murdered, exploded at its core, torn to shreds, blown to smithereens. The smallest of smallest bits, the heart of the atom, was broken apart with a violence that made the earth and heavens quake. In an instant, in a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns, the distance between heaven and earth was obliterated, not merely imaginatively crossed out by Newton's natural philosophy, but physically crossed by a mushroom cloud reaching into the stratosphere. Let me back up by way of moving forward and offer a morsel, a taste of what I understand agential realism to be up to, partially by way of touching into how it refigures time as space-time mattering. For making sense is a matter of touching, sensing, being in touch. Touching is always already about returning, remembering, coming back around again anew. For if in telling time, or rather space-time mattering becoming a telling of us, we take a moment to examine how so many disciplinary and interdisciplinary fields are always already thinking with core concepts in physics, such as space, time, matter, causality, and more, the analysis must entail not simply trading Newtonian ideas for the cool stuff of quantum physics, but also crucially the tracing of entanglements of the very violences that physics helps produce as part of bringing forward new imaginaries and in their materiality. In other words, it is crucial to remember, to take stock, to return, to turn over and over again the soil that gets encrusted, unloosening the ghosts that are assumed to be laid to rest and long forgotten. Nuclear bombings are not events in time. They occupy time, colonize it, do violence to it. Nuclear bomb blasts are not a set of independent events situated in space and time. Nuclear time beings are specific configurings of the field of space-time mattering, a memory field where ghostliness haunts time itself. Nuclear time beings are always already ghostly. Untimeliness is their brand, their very nature. Deep time, both deep histories and deep futures, intergenerational mutations, out of timeliness itself, leaching into bones, groundwater, atmospheric particulates of split seconds raining down, frozen bits of time hardened into glassy residue, shattering histories and futures measured out as afterlives, half-lives, half of a half of a half, counting radioactive bits without end. The very existence of nuclear decay undermines eventfulness, writing a temporality of indefinite ongoingness into the core of radioactive material existence. Nuclear decay is not a singular happening, it pervades time. For example, plutonium-242's decay time is 376,000 years, meaning that in 376,000 years, half of the plutonium-242 sample will have decayed. In another 376,000 years, a half of that half will have decayed, and so on. Radioactivity counted out across innumerable generations, left ticking eons beyond time. Nuclear time beings are matters of quantum physics. Physicists began working on quantum field theory starting in the late 1920s, but quickly ran into difficulties. Most seriously, the so-called infinities problem, which was not resolved before the war. Histories of physics mark the war effort as specifically interrupting the development of the theory, at least in the West, because the same physicists who were hard at work on quantum field theory were called on to work on and take the lead on the development of new military technologies. This is not a coincidence. Nuclear physics developed alongside and inside quantum field theory, and many of the top physicists around the world were working on both. Skills, techniques, approaches to cracking hard problems, and more were traded back and forth between military research and the most abstract efforts in theoretical physics. In many ways, for physicists around the globe, the war effort was dis/continuous with work in pure theoretical physics. It is perhaps no surprise then that at the very core of quantum field theory are traces of militarism, colonialism, and racialized capitalism, together with fundamental questions of the nature of being and time, as I've argued elsewhere, that have the potential to explode the grammar and logics of radioactivity's assumed naturalness. The clocks were arrested in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945 at 8:15 a.m. Time stopped. Its internal mechanism melted. What happens to time when nuclear forces are harnessed and unleashed? Is not the very fabric of time being ripped apart, shredded into bits, vaporized, dispersed, made particulate, whisked away on the breeze, condensed into raindrops that fall to the ground, making puddles on streets and quenching the soil's thirst. Sent up in smoke as the water invades the electrical systems of nuclear plants, leached into the groundwater as the nuclear core melts. Time is, was, has been crossed out. Time drawn out like taffy, twisted and swirled in the form of hot metal, cooled, hardened, and splintered. In the 20th century, time is given a finite lifetime, a decayed time, an afterlife. Moments live and die. The bomb in Hiroshima continues to go off. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, those who had survived the blast instinctively made their way to ground zero, making the usual kinds of assumptions about the eventfulness of harm from a conventional bomb to look for survivors. But this is no ordinary bomb, and it hadn't finished going off, and still hasn't. Many were further exposed to radiation, and they died. Others lived, but their cells tick with little time bombs that explode into cancers, or they pass mutations on to future generations. Living and non-living beings become carriers, and transmitters of radioactivity without end. As a physicist, I take it that it is my responsibility to make evident the forces of violence that exist not only in the applications of science, but inside its very core, in the epistemological, or rather onto-epistemological workings of the theory itself. and to interrupt the violent, storied materialities physicists have been bringing into the world and bring forth alternative storied material practices, new old practices of knowledge world making that include holding the sciences accountable in ways that are integral to the very practice of science. I have argued that what we call physical forces, such as the nuclear force, and what we call social and political forces are not separable, and that objectivity is a matter of tracing the entanglements of various forces and their specificities, and as such, this matter of tracing entanglements is an integral part of the practice of science itself. When it comes to nuclear landscapes, vaporized bodies and other losses may not be very visibly discernible, but they are surely not intangible. There are losses emblazoned on walls, shadows of what once was become eternal. The flash so bright, the heat so hot, nearly every surface becomes a photographic plate. Loss is not absence, but a marked presence, or rather a marking that troubles the divide between absence and presence. These devastated land timescapes are surely haunted, but not merely in the sense that witnesses memories of the dead of past events, particularly violent ones, linger there. Hauntings are not immaterial, and they are an ineliminable feature of existing material conditions. In troubling times and ecologies of nothingness, returning, remembering, and facing the incalculable, I diffractively read quantum field theory, the basis for nuclear physics and the making of an atomic bomb, through a novella, From Trinity to Trinity by Kyoko Hayashi, a story of returning, wherein a survivor of the Nagasaki atomic bomb seeks an embodied way to remember her 52 classmates who were incinerated and thereby robbed of their own deaths. Her practice of remembering entails tracing the plutonium bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki back to the Trinity test site, the first place a plutonium bomb was exploded in the desert of the place the colonizers call New Mexico. The body clocks of Hibakusha, nuclear bomb survivors, have been synchronized to the bomb. Their cells tick with the rhythms of radioactivity, half-lives indeed. Passed along to future generations through mutations, the bomb continues to go off all these years later, while nuclear violence has canceled out futures, individual and collective, even deep futures. How to ensure the safety of buried radioactive elements, half of a half of a half, counting time out by the tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, possibly beyond human time. Tracing entanglements is embodied practice of remembering, which is not about returning to what was, but rather about materially reconfiguring space-time mattering in ways that attempt to do justice to account for the devastation wrought and to produce openings, new possible histories, reconfigurings of space-time mattering through which time beings might find a way to endure. I think some of you have, or maybe all of you have seen this time lapse, but I wanted to play it here just in case some of you haven't. an enormously powerful art piece, I think. Well, the dominant American imaginary is that only 2 atomic bombs have ever been exploded. The devastating blast that killed more than 175,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that these 2 isolated incidences ended a war. During the so-called Cold War, more than 2,500 nuclear bombs were detonated, the overwhelming majority of them on indigenous lands. And this doesn't even begin to count the colonizing forces of slow and not so slow nuclear violence that are an integral part of the nuclear fuel chain, including uranium mining, processing, and nuclear waste storage, which disproportionately affects indigenous peoples. For example, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Navajo Nation have identified more than 523 abandoned uranium mines scattered throughout Arizona and New Mexico, including dozens located dangerously close to homes or water sources. Diné environmental activist Leona Morgan points out that the uranium fuel cycle is a matter of ecocide and resource colonization. For example, the world's largest uranium spill occurred at the Church Rock uranium mill on private land in New Mexico, where a dam broke, pouring 100 miles of liquid uranium waste onto Diné lands. Despite the fact that this was the largest release of radioactive materials in the US and occurred just 3 months after the accident at 3 Mile Island, few people have heard about it. Because of the vast uranium deposits on Diné lands, fracking can bring up uranium as well as radon. Diné people currently face did during the pandemic when I wrote this, Diné people face the highest rates of COVID-19 in the US. Environmental injustices are never just one. Apocalypse upon apocalypse after apocalypse, and even so, or maybe just so, Diné poet Jake Skeets speaks of a decolonial sense of hope in terms of deep time, pushing up from the ground, moving vertically, breaking through the encrusted soil of colonialism with its structures of horizontal linear time, the narrative of time as progression, the universalizing time of colonialism and disaster capitalism. Physics has a history of being the helpmate of nuclearism, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, racism, and other forces of violence. But physics is not a totality, and so it is worth asking if, for all its multiple forms of complicity, are there nonetheless openings that exist within physics that trouble its hegemony, its authority, its unapologetic epistemological imperialism that claims to cover all space, time, and matter? Is it possible that inside the material practices of physics, we might find radical political imaginaries that are resources for the flourishing of all beings rather than destruction, for justice rather than the perpetuation of violence? Facing the particular violences of nuclear colonialism, for example, which disproportionately affects indigenous peoples, we might ask, is it possible to refigure the theory behind nuclear physics, quantum field theory, in such a way that it is responsible to insights from indigenous onto epistemologies focused on relationality, reciprocity, and responsibility? Jake Skeets writes poetically, powerfully, and compellingly about the role of what he calls radical remembering and pushing forward into a new realm of thinking about memory, time, and land. For Skeets, quote, "Memory is a touchy thing in that you can touch it," unquote. It is not at all something ephemeral, but a physicality tied to land. He even talks about memory as being literally scarred into his body. The materiality of memory is crucial to his politics and his poetics. Skeets writes, "Memory is a physical construction, While memory is normally associated with the cognitive functions of the brain, I argue that memory's connection to time imposes its existence onto physical space as much as it does onto cognitive space. I am always fascinated by the idea that the starlight we see today is in fact old light, cast out from a time existing simultaneously in the past, present, and future. The star's light began in its present, a past to us when we see it in our present, which is the star's future, because sunlight takes 8 minutes and 20 seconds to reach the earth. The things we see are in some ways a part of the past. Pasts, presents, and futures exist simultaneously, unquote. At this point, I want to begin to weave 3 threads of this talk, to braid or diffract 3 sources of illumination in the night sky, as it were, into a constellation. The 3 are my agential realist reading of quantum field theory, already a diffractive storied materiality threaded through with insights from theories of justice, as my diffractive reading of Hayashi's From Trinity to Trinity, and the material poetics of skeets, placing them in constellation with one another, making a weave, hinting at a diffractive reading of each through the other. Diffraction refuses the logics of analogy and parallelism and the temporality of the new. What I am proposing is not a matter of weaving together allegedly independent threads now for the first time, as it were. It is not a matter of my putting them in conversation with one another for the first time, since they are already materially entangled. These storied materialities are each their own unique weavings, threaded through with different entanglements, while each is ultimately entangled with the others. Constellations in their patterning together are made up of twinklings of different yet entangled histories. So it is with respect for their deep differences, but in acknowledgement that they are already materially in conversation with one another, already interdependent, that I make this small offering. So for the rest of the talk, I'm not going to struggle with my non-PowerPoint, as it were, but we're going to look at this beautiful painting by scholar and artist Joanne Barker. This is called Dancing on Mars, and she has kindly given me permission to use this. From Trinity to Trinity is not a Western time travel novel, but a time-hopping chronicle of one particular infinite moment of time, a time diffraction, time superposition tale, an embodied pilgrimage committed to tracing the material entanglements, a risky journey of placing one's body in touch with the materiality of specific colonizing histories, an embodied partial accounting of all possible histories, an iterative circling back around, touching the infinite alterity that constitutes a point, a moment. What is the structure of the infinity of a moment labeled on some calendars as August 9? Returning to a moment to face the incalculable. Skeets writes, memory is woven in a unique matrix with land, language, and time. Native people have already mastered time travel. They are able to conjure the deepest parts of humanhood through the act of memory. Radical remembering, then, has the potential to teach a way of being that isn't tied to a capitalist future, but is instead reliant on the self's engagement with the natural world. I don't mean that we should return to pre-contact native life, but we should push forward into a new realm of thinking about memory, time, and land. Standing before a photograph of an aerial view of Nagasaki after the bombing on August 9, 1945 in the National Atomic Museum in New Mexico, Hayashi's unnamed protagonist jumps in time but continues the thought, asking herself, what is the story of this very land that the museum stands on? Why here? What is the connection of this land to the obliterated Japanese city shown in the photograph? On her way to Trinity Site, New Mexico, Hayashi traces the entanglements of histories of violences all coexisting in this now, including those of European colonial conquest of Native American peoples and lands, entangled with the testing of the plutonium bomb on indigenous land in the desert of what the colonizers call New Mexico, entangled with the same kind of bomb being dropped a month later in Nagasaki, entangled with uranium mining and nuclear waste buried on indigenous lands in the American Southwest, entangled with the Fukushima disaster, entangled with existing and future cancers of all atomic bomb survivors and their offspring, including the human and non-human nobodies who were downwind from the Trinity test site. Memory, Skeets explains, exists as a kind of spatiotemporal entity because time, memory, and land are woven together. One cannot look at the Grand Canyon without conjuring the deep time needed to create it. I grow weary of the word spatial because I am more interested in the idea of terrestrial temporal matrix. I call this terra-temporal matrix the memory field because of memory's unique engagement with time and land. Time is terrestrial and feeds our cognitive development in relationship to the universe itself. The word terrestrial also grows heavy. It has similarities with words like subluminary, which place the terrestrial opposite a religious or spiritual space. The word temporal isn't adequate either. The memory field is a matrix of time, memory, and land. Land's connection to time feeds our development as human beings, and understanding this connection strengthens our relationship to the universe itself. On my agential realist reading of quantum physics, space-time mattering is a dynamic, ongoing reconfiguring of a field of relationalities among moments, places, and bodies in their inseparability. Memory is written into the very fabric of the universe. Time, beings, becomings, or excitations and condensations of mattering fielding of time being, a topologically complex and dynamically differentiating, iteratively reconfiguring materialization of here, theirs, now, thens, being, becomings, an infinity of possibilities condensed into now, every now, this thick now, bursting with radical possibilities for remembering, rebodying the world otherwise. These are ghostly matters. Hauntings are not mere subjective rememberings of a past assumed to be left behind in actuality, but rather hauntings are the ontological rememberings, a dynamism of ontological indeterminacy of time being in its materiality. The climax of the novella is the narrator's trip to Trinity site, the place where the first plutonium bomb was detonated on July 16, 1945 at 5:29 a.m. It is here at the end of her journey, the very place where it all began, standing in the midst of a desert inside a fenced area with nothing inside it save a monument to nothingness, to ground zero, that the fullness of these embodied tracings of the various colonizing entanglements comes full circle. Trinity is the starting point of my August 9. It is also the final destination of Hibakusha, from Trinity to Trinity. If I make that journey, I can hold August 9 within my life circle. If I can never be free from the event, I should end my relationship by swallowing it. What does it mean to swallow an event? Perhaps this is an evocation of the Ouroboros, the mythical symbol of the serpent biting its tail, representing creation out of destruction, life out of death. Or perhaps it means to ingest the event like radiation, to take it into your gut, to feel it leach into your bones, mutate your innards, and reset your cellular clocks. Perhaps it is about the possibility of metabolizing the trauma, transforming the self from victim to survivor. Perhaps it is a way of doing the self, of touching oneself through touching all others, taking in multitudes of others that make up the very matter of one's being in order to materially transform the self and one's material sense of self. Perhaps it is about the willingness to put oneself at risk, to place one's body on this wounded land, to be in touch with it, to have a felt sense of its textures, to come to terms with a shared sense of vulnerability and invisibility, to feel the ways that this land, the colonizers' void, which marks their continuing practices of avoidance, always already inhabits the core, the nucleus of your being. Even the smallest bits of space, time, mattering are an enormous multitude. Each individual, each body of matter you hold in your hand is made up of entanglements, material relations of responsibility, sedimented histories of interactions with itself and all others across spaces and times. On my agential realist account, there is no such thing as a discrete individual with its own roster of properties. In fact, the other, the constitutively excluded, is always already within. The very notion of the self is a troubling of the interior-exterior distinction. Matter in its essence, and this is precisely what is being called into question, or rather, matter is the very, or rather, this is the very question matter keeps asking itself, okay, is an ongoing enactment of the undoing of individuality, self, other, identity, property, and kind, the very stuff that makes us up entanglements of colonialism, capitalism, racism, and other forms of violence. Matter itself is constitutively inhabited by a deconstructive force, not a destructive force that blows itself apart, but rather an energetics that entails the undoing of notions that have been sedimented into Western philosophy and physics. A decolonizing practice of doing physics cannot entail grabbing hold of Western inventiveness to create something new while leaving the sedimented histories and futures of violence unaddressed. On the contrary, on my agential realist account of quantum field theory, the past is not over, and the future is not what will simply unfold. And practices of knowing and being are not separable, so that objectivity is not about distancing, but on the contrary, it is a matter of being in touch, of being in reciprocal relation, a matter of responsibility. This new old storied material scientific account contains within its core not a destructive force to be unleashed, but a seed that holds within it a material force of justice and the possibilities for living and dying otherwise. Thank you.